There's a spot on the Texas-New Mexico border where a town called Glen Rio still stands, technically. The gas station is there, the motel sign is there, faded but legible. The cafe building is there, roof half caved in. What's missing is almost everyone. Glen Rio grew up serving travelers on US Route 66, and it thrived doing exactly that for decades, until Interstate 40 was built just south of it in the early 1970s and simply routed traffic around the town entirely. The businesses didn't fail because of bad management or bad luck. They failed because the road that fed them stopped delivering customers, almost overnight, and there was no version of this economy that survived without it. Today, Glen Rio sits empty in the desert, a documented ghost town, one of dozens like it strung across 8 states. The physical remains of a highway that America built, glorified, depended on, and then formally erased from the map. This is the story of US Route 66, 2,448 miles connecting Chicago to Los Angeles. A road that carried Dust Bowl refugees fleeing disaster, carried a nation's post-war road trip fantasy, carried black travelers navigating a country that could turn hostile after dark. And then, after 59 years of federal designation, was quietly decertified and stopped existing as an official highway altogether. It looks, from a distance, like nostalgia. It is actually a case study in how infrastructure decisions reshape and end the lives of entire communities. Here's the scale of what we're talking about. Route 66 was officially established on November 11, 1926, as part of the newly created United States numbered highway system, running through Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. It operated as a federally designated highway for exactly 59 years, until June 27, 1985, when it was formally decommissioned. Removed from the U.S. highway system entirely, its shield signs no longer legally standing on most of its original path. In the decades in between, it carried hundreds of thousands of displaced Dust Bowl families west during the 1930s, became famous through a hit song and a novel, and then, piece by piece throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, was systematically bypassed by interstate freeways built alongside or over much of its original path, town by town, until nothing legally remained of it as a designated route. The paradox of Route 66 is this: the very thing that made it legendary, small towns, local businesses, a slower, human-scale way of crossing the country, is precisely what made it obsolete. Route 66 was a 2-lane road that passed directly through the main street of nearly every town along its path, which is exactly why so many roadside diners, motor courts, and gas stations sprang up to serve travelers. But that same design, forcing all cross-country traffic through Main Street after Main Street, was slow, congested, and increasingly unworkable for a nation that wanted to move goods and people faster. The interstate system was built explicitly to solve that problem. And in solving it, it routed traffic around, not through, the very towns whose entire economy had been built on travelers stopping. The history here begins earlier than most people realize. Before Route 66 had a number, it was a patchwork of separate local roads, more myth than highway, no cohesive federal identity. The push to change that came from Cyrus Avery, a highway commissioner from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who became the driving advocate for a continuous federal highway connecting Chicago to Los Angeles, passing directly through Oklahoma along the way. Working with John T. Woodruff of Springfield, Missouri, Avery co-founded the U.S. Highway 66 Association in 1926, an organization built specifically to promote and advertise the new road to the traveling public. In the original federal numbering proposal, this route was actually slated to be designated US 60. Objections from officials in other states forced a renumbering, and the route that became the cultural icon was assigned the number 66 instead. A detail most people driving it today have never heard, despite the number itself becoming one of the most recognized road designations in American history. The road's first great test came almost immediately, and it wasn't a road trip. It was a mass exodus. Throughout the 1930s, drought and economic collapse across the Great Plains, the disaster known as the Dust Bowl, drove hundreds of thousands of farm families from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and neighboring states toward California, seeking any kind of work. Route 66, still a young highway, became the primary corridor for that migration, carrying displaced families west in overloaded cars and trucks along a road that, in this era, was still only partially paved. John Steinbeck traveled sections of this same route in the mid-1930s, observing the migrant camps directly, and used that first-hand experience to write The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, in which he gave Route 66 the name history remembers it by, the Mother Road. The novel wasn't romanticizing the highway. It was documenting, in fictional form, a real and desperate use of a real road by real displaced families. Let's walk that road now, the way both those Dust Bowl migrants and later generations of post-war tourists actually experienced it. Because the physical journey explains everything about what this highway became. Leaving Chicago, the route ran southwest through Illinois and Missouri, threading through small agricultural towns before crossing into Kansas for a brief stretch, then into Oklahoma, Cyrus Avery's home state and one of the route's cultural centers. From there, it cut across the Texas Panhandle, through New Mexico's high desert, across Arizona, and finally into California, terminating near the Pacific in Santa Monica. Along nearly every mile of that path, the road ran directly through town centers. Not around them, not past them on a bypass, but straight down Main Street, meaning every gas station, motor court, and diner in every one of those towns depended on that traffic physically passing their front door. By the post-war years, this same road that had carried displaced farm families west now carried an entirely different kind of traveler, the American road trip tourist, newly mobile, newly affluent, driving west for vacation rather than survival. In 1946, songwriter Bobby Troup composed Get Your Kicks on Route 66, recorded that same year by Nat King Cole and the King Cole Trio, and the song became a major hit on both the R&B and pop charts. That single song did more to fix Route 66 in the American cultural imagination than perhaps anything else associated with the road, a highway of hardship in one decade rebranded within a generation as a highway of leisure and adventure. But that image of open road freedom concealed a much harder reality for a significant portion of the travelers actually using it. For Black motorists during the era of segregation, Route 66 was not a carefree road trip. It ran through towns and counties where the wrong stop after dark could mean real danger. Historical research on the route documents that of the 89 counties Route 66 passed through, an estimated 44 were sundown counties, places where Black travelers faced exclusion, harassment, or the explicit threat of violence if found there after nightfall. Victor Hugo Green published the Negro Motorist Green Book from 1936 to 1966, a travel guide identifying which hotels, restaurants, and gas stations along routes like this one were safe for Black travelers to use. On Route 66 specifically, that guide wasn't a convenience. It was a navigational necessity for survival, mapping a version of the same highway that ran parallel to, but was fundamentally different from, the one being celebrated in a hit song at almost exactly the same time. Now, the dangers to this road, because unlike a mountain or a lake, Route 66's threat wasn't physical to the traveler. It was economic and existential to the towns that depended on it, and it arrived in layers over decades. The first threat was structural obsolescence. A two-lane highway routed through every town's main street was, by the 1950s, simply too slow for a country moving toward high-speed, high-volume, cross-country freight and travel. The road's greatest asset, direct contact with local communities, was also its fatal design flaw in an era demanding efficiency. The second threat was the interstate highway system itself, authorized under federal legislation in the 1950s, which was engineered from the outset to bypass town centers rather than run through them. Interstate 40, Interstate 44, and other freeways were built alongside or directly over long sections of the old Route 66 corridor throughout the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, each new stretch of interstate diverting traffic away from whatever remained of the original two-lane road beneath or beside it. The third threat, compounding directly from the second, was the collapse of the roadside economy, town by town, in a rolling wave that took decades to complete rather than happening all at once. Glen Rio lost its passing traffic when I-40 was completed nearby in the early 1970s. The pattern repeated across the entire route as each new interstate segment opened, until finally, on October 13, 1984, Williams, Arizona became the last Route 66 town to be bypassed, when the final 6-mile stretch of Interstate 40 opened around it in an event significant enough to be marked with an official ceremony. The literal last moment a driver was still legally required to pass through a town's streets to continue west on US 66. The fourth threat was the final, formal one: total federal decertification. On June 27, 1985, U.S. Route 66 was officially removed from the United States highway system. Not just bypassed in places, not just diminished. Legally, it stopped existing as a designated federal highway anywhere along its original length. 59 years after Cyrus Avery secured its number, the road that had carried Dust Bowl refugees, inspired a hit song, and required a separate travel guide for Black Americans to use safely, ceased to be an official route at all. Here are the real, documented moments that show exactly how this played out on the ground. Glen Rio, straddling the Texas-New Mexico border, is the clearest case. The town's Rock Island Railroad Depot had already closed in 1955, a first serious blow to its economy even before the interstate arrived. Then, when I-40 was completed nearby in the early 1970s and routed south of town, Route 66 traffic was cut off entirely. By the 1980s and into the 2000s, Glen Rio was effectively deserted, and today the Glen Rio Historic District exists as a documented ghost town. Gas stations, a motel, a cafe, all standing empty. The lesson here is specific. A town's economic survival, built entirely around a single highway's traffic, offered no cushion whatsoever once that traffic was legally and physically redirected elsewhere. There was no transition plan, no alternative industry. There was only the road, and then there wasn't. Williams, Arizona tells a different, almost inverse story. As the last town bypassed on October 13, 1984, its residents knew the moment was coming and marked it with a formal ceremony rather than simply watching a slow decline. The lesson from Williams is about foresight. Because Williams was among the last to be bypassed, it had the advantage of watching every other Route 66 town's fate play out first and could plan, diversifying toward tourism tied explicitly to its last town on Route 66 status, in a way that towns bypassed decades earlier, with no precedent to learn from, could not. And the story of the Green Book represents a third and entirely different kind of documented reality on this same stretch of pavement. An entire parallel travel infrastructure built by necessity from 1936 to 1966, mapping safety rather than scenery. The lesson here is that the same 30-year span in which Route 66 was being sold to the American public as a symbol of post-war freedom and adventure was, for a significant portion of the population using that same road, a 30-year span requiring careful, life-or-death route planning that had nothing to do with adventure at all. Here is the turn worth sitting with. Route 66 was not destroyed by neglect, and it was not a victim of decline in any passive sense. It was replaced, deliberately, by a newer piece of infrastructure explicitly designed to do what it did: faster. The interstate system wasn't an accident that happened to Route 66. It was a policy decision, executed over 3 decades, that prioritized speed and volume of interstate commerce over the economic survival of the small towns a 2-lane highway had allowed to exist in the first place. The road itself never had any stake in whether Glen Rio survived or Williams adapted. It was simply asphalt, following the incentives of the engineers and legislators who built its replacement. So what actually happened to Route 66 after 1985, factually, is this. Significant portions of the original road still physically exist today, some maintained as historic byways, some drivable, some now serving as frontage roads running alongside the interstates that replaced them. States have worked with the National Park Service's Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program to protect surviving historic structures along the route, and many towns that adapted, leaning into the highway's cultural legacy as a heritage tourism draw rather than a functioning transportation corridor, have found a second economic life doing exactly that. The practical reality for anyone visiting today is straightforward. Route 66 no longer exists as a single, continuous, federally designated highway, but large sections remain physically drivable, dotted with the same gas stations, motels, and diners that once served Dust Bowl migrants and post-war tourists alike. Some restored, some abandoned, some standing exactly the way Glen Rio's do, empty but still there. Glen Rio still sits on that Texas-New Mexico line today. Its buildings intact enough to photograph, its population close enough to zero to qualify, by any honest definition, as a ghost town. It didn't burn down. It wasn't destroyed by storm or disaster. It was simply routed around by a newer road built a few miles south, and it never recovered from that single engineering decision. Route 66 spent 59 years as the road that built towns like Glen Rio, and one afternoon in the 1970s undid all of it, permanently, without a single dramatic event. Just a new highway, opening a few miles away, carrying the same traffic somewhere